So welcome all to the first talk of our semester here at NYU in the U.S. Asia Law Institute's speaker series. We're very privileged to start with what is an unusually big picture, a book. And it's great to start with a book that focuses not on one particular question of international law or foreign law, but on virtually every question in international law. The book is called Democracy for a Sustainable World, and it's written by James Bacchus, who is, if you look at our website, it gives you a little brief bio, distinguished university professor of global affairs, director of the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity at the University of Central Florida. I have known him for many years as a member of Congress, one of the most distinguished people in what was a very active Congress, unlike these days, and distinguished in part because of his deep knowledge in trade law. And as being the chief judge, twice the chair, in fact, of the appellate body of the World Trade Organization. And he has served in many other capacities. And the book reflects that. This is a book now. He's had 5 prior books, and this one, like 2 of those others, has been listed by the Financial Times as one of the best books for 2025. And Democracy for a Sustainable World looks back to ancient Greece for models of not just what would be a sustainable democracy with respect to what was then city-states, and we will call them nation-states today, but also, and I think this is part of the most interesting part of this very large book, is what it would mean to have sustainable democracy within states. And I think one of the characteristics of this book is a deep critique at both levels, a deep critique of what we call democracies today, including a pointed one of the United States, its political parties, its leadership, its lack of activity by Congress, the lack of checks and balances, and et cetera. But it goes far more deeply and beyond the recipes that I certainly see among my colleagues who teach, for example, constitutional law. And it goes far beyond the recipes I see by international law professors who address, for example, UN reform or WTO reform. But before we get to that big picture, I can't resist. You are probably one of the world's leading experts on trade law. Let's just say the World Trade Organization is in a bit of a state these days. I think unless our audience has been hiding under a rock, they probably have heard of tariff wars. They have had that the consequences of some of those tariff wars have been trade deals. I don't want to consider them treaties. I think they're just pacts, let's just say, in which the very pacts themselves are maybe less than consistent with what the World Trade Organization foresaw, anticipated with respect to lowering of tariffs, most favored nation treatment, non-discrimination in short, for tariffs, the Liberation Day announcements of tariffs, the demise of the WTO appellate body, the attack on the very premise of the organization that ever freer trade among nations benefits all, have come under enormous pressure, not just from the Trump administration. This preceded him through Obama and Biden, and now possibly other countries may follow. And so I guess I want you to give us the benefit of your views on what you see. And there is now much to my surprise, frankly, from the Trump administration, a proposal to reform the WTO. I would have thought reform was beneath his notice, but I'm curious what you think of the current state of our trade regime, such as it is, and of Trump's proposals to reform it. And if you're welcome to put it in context of the book, but we'll jump into the book in a much after this initial pause to please all the trade specialists that were guided here because of you.
Well, thank you so much, Jose. And I suppose it's true to say that I have an invisible tattoo on my forehead that says WTO. So I'm often asked about trade, and I don't mind at all. It's extraordinarily important to everyone. in the world and important to the shared future we hope to have. In terms of what the current administration has proposed to the WTO, I would hardly call it reform. Rather, I would say it's a roundabout way of continuing to further denigrate and disintegrate the WTO. I say that in part because central to the proposals is one of abandoning the basic principle of non-discrimination in trade that is the very heart of the world trading system and has been since we invented it 3/4 of a century ago. In fact, if you look at most favored nation treatment, non-discrimination, the idea goes back 800 years to the Hanseatic League, and it's on the basis of mutually beneficially lowering barriers to trade everywhere, whenever you lower them anywhere, that the world has made the economic progress that we've made and the great prosperity we've seen emerge in the past 3/4 of a century. So this proposal, if it were accepted, would cause a change in Article 1 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which says that anytime any one member of the trading system lowers a trade barrier, a tariff, or other barrier on a particular good to imports from another member of the system, it must do so immediately and unconditionally to all the other members. When that happens, the volume of trade as a consequence increases enormously, and thus the opportunities for sharing and the further gains of trade, the bounty of trade domestically, increase commensurately. That's not been noticed yet in the American media, and that's what's being overlooked by those in the United States who are making this proposal.
Do you think there is a prospect for a good number of nations to go down this route?
I don't really. As you know, the European Union has responded to the U.S. Proposal by saying we ought to talk about these issues, and indeed we should, but one of the things we shouldn't talk about is abandoning the basic principle of non-discrimination. If you look in GATT and in the other agreements that altogether comprise the WTO treaty, you see there are many exceptions to the basic rule of non-discrimination. Cases of general exceptions for health and safety and the environment, for example, national security, free trade agreements, and more. And then there are other agreements that address some of the issues that the Trump administration and others are quite rightly cared about, such as governmental subsidies that have been widely abused by China, for example. But there are agreements on this, and there are rules. The answer is to improve these rules. It's not to abandon the basic principle of the entire system.
Okay. So I guess one thing that does come out in your book, and we'll just start coasting into the book itself, in the book, you defend the international rule of law. You quoted at one point at what you think it means. You also defend enforceable courts in the enforceable World Trade Organization's dispute settlement, including its appellate body. Do you think that it's possible to restore that, having now been paralyzed not just by one president, but three in the US? Is there really a return to the appellate body, an enforceable court and with enforceable law in the WTO? Do you see that as possible?
Not in the near term. When this first happened, when the United States began to move away from binding dispute settlement and the rule of law, and tried to bring about the demise of the appellate body, which it ultimately did, in terms of emptying the bench of any judges, I was, impassioned about restoring it immediately. I devoted a decade of my life to establishing the appellate body, and I'm quite proud of what we did there in terms of making it a tribunal that upheld the international rule of law, not only in trade, but also proved there could be such a thing as a real international law that is enforceable. But now, given what's happened, I'm afraid that a combination of the continuing intransigence of the United States on the issue and the sad acquiescence of so many other countries to the Trump administration, not only on trade, but on so much else, it would be a mistake to restore the appellate body now because it would not be the appellate body. It would be much more likely to be a political body rather than a body that upheld the rule of law. So it would be the opposite of what we need.
Okay. So let's turn then with that introduction to satisfy some of the trade specialists listening in or perhaps in the room to the book. So this is a book with major contentions. And so I'd like you to spend a bit of time, perhaps 15, 20 minutes, which is awesomely difficult given the complexity of the book. Tell us what the book is fundamentally about. How do we achieve sustainable democracy at both the international and domestic levels, and not just within trade? So can you say some of the major contentions in the book?
The book is about how we can begin to fulfill the unfulfilled promise of democracy, which is true self-rule, and how we can put the structures in place to govern ourselves that will enable us to do what we urgently need to begin doing now, which is provide new forms of governance that can help us achieve human well-being on a thriving planet. History is often a teacher. If we look back at the first experiment in what we can see as democracy in ancient Athens 2,500 years ago, we can see shortcomings, to be sure. The Athenians did not allow women to be citizens. They did not allow immigrants to be citizens. They kept tens of thousands of human beings enslaved to do their whim and their will. But looking beyond that, if we can, for those who were privileged to be Athenian citizens, there was the truest democracy the world has yet seen. It was a direct democracy. And furthermore, it was one that, because of the use of sortition, random selection, in choosing who would be the day-to-day executives of the city-state of Athens in that region called Attica in Greece, they had the truest experience of self-government and self-rule of anyone ever in history. So I asked myself a dozen years ago when I was standing on a hillside called the Pnyx, just across from the Acropolis, where Cleisthenes, a renegade aristocrat, and other Athenians invented democracy in 508 BC. What does that experience have to teach us today? And I concluded it has much to teach us because the Athenians built of Athens not only a democracy, but one that was a knowledge network that got a multiplier effect in terms of producing well-being, producing prosperity at that time and in that place that led to what we still see as remarkable. Athenian art, Athenian culture, Athenian history, Thucydides, Herodotus, and more, philosophy, and so on. All of that happened in that place, in my view, and in the view of many classicists, in no small part because of the ambiance that was created of a democratic system in that ancient city-state. So Athens was different from hundreds of other Greek city-states in this respect. Some others, including many under the influence of Athens, became democratic along the way, but no one was truly democratic in the way Athens was. So we look back there, and to me, a key is the Athenian citizenry did everything they could to make those who were privileged, admittedly a minority, but those who were privileged to be citizens, truly people who engaged in self-rule. The key was participation. The subtitle of my book is The Path from the Pnyx, and the path from the Pnyx is the path of democratic participation. So when I look today at what we say is democracy, I do not see democracy, even in the representative democracies that adorn the world and have been here for a century or more. In our case, 2.5 centuries coming up July. I certainly support continuing with our democracy, but it's not what democracy is supposed to be. It's not a place in which the 350 million Americans engage in true self-rule. And we're much closer to true self-rule than the vast majority of the billions of other people in the world. So my book is an attempt to ask and answer the question, how should we, how must we change our forms of governments in order to provide for democratic participation that can be true self-rule?
So let's turn to that before we turn to the actual prescriptions you offer. So the characteristics of representation and sortism that you describe, where, as I understand it from the book, it wasn't all about, is this person representing a group of people, but another part of Athenian democracy was choosing a random selection of people who said, yes, I will volunteer for this task. And you would pick them not as representative of anyone, but as some sort of collective wisdom. And it's that combination of representation and collective wisdom that you see as the heart of it. Can you say a bit about what that translates into?
Yes.
For countries that are not even close to the first part? And I'm thinking particularly Asia. I'm thinking China. I'm thinking to some extent Singapore. I'm thinking South Korea. I'm thinking Vietnam, many different countries, but all of which I think would fail the test of sustainable democracy for sustainable development, as I see in your book. And I think it's particularly challenging to do what you're saying or to achieve what you're saying in Asia. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yes, let me say a few more words in predicate, and then I will speak at some length about how I see Asia in particular. What I argue in the book is that we need to have, in governing ourselves, the combination of the best of individual wisdom and the best of collective wisdom, and that the two together can bring about the best of human self-governance democratically. Thus, I propose reforms in representative institutions now, which we can talk about later, to make them provide what I call right representation. And I propose the creation of new institutions of sortition, randomly selected, to acquire the best of collective wisdom. Let me turn to Asia. I have proposed with respect, for example, to all international institutions, and we've already started this with the Conference of Parties of the Conference on Climate Change in November in Brazil. I have proposed that we have what would amount to global citizen assemblies to address decision-making, not just make advice in these international institutions. In the book, I call these circles of participation that will be randomly selected from among, as in Athens, volunteers who would step forward and say, I'm willing to serve. And if you read the book, you'll see that I go on at great length about how we would engage in sufficient financial and other outreach to make it possible for people throughout the planet who would not otherwise be able to afford to take the time to do this to volunteer. And I would do this irrespective of the borders of nation states. In my account, I would not involve the nation states at all in this selection process. I would simply go around them. This would be post-Westphalian, if you will, in international law terms.
Strikingly so.
Strikingly so. And it would result, because of where people live in the world, in about a third of the people who would be the participants in these randomly selected sortition circles in every institution being either Indian or Chinese, and at least half of them being Asian.
Dramatically changed.
So this will be a dramatic change in the world. I have no problem with this whatsoever.
Wouldn't nation states have some problem?
Some nation states may have problems with it, which is why we go around nation states. In my view, every person in the world, every 8 billion and more of them, should have an equal right to have an equal opportunity to engage in true self-rule by engaging in democratic participation. And they may be chosen to serve for a year or two on one of these circles of participation, just as the ancient Athenian citizens were, and then go on back to their lives. But they would be participating not as an American, not as a Chinese, not as a Filipino, not as a Singaporean, but as a human being. I think it's past time that we begin to take the core of the promise of democracy seriously, and that means that we need to begin treating humanity as a whole. We need to keep the cosmopolitan promise that humanity is one and start acting as if humanity is one. As you know, in my congressional career, I was much involved in trying to advance the space program as a member of Congress. And one of the things I did in Congress is that I was one of those who took what was originally intended to be an American space station and transformed it into an international space station. Now, I wanted every country in the world to be able to participate. We ended with only a few, but it's still up there circling for another couple of years, an international endeavor. I think humanity should go into space as one. Of course, right now we're doing the opposite. Right now, in so many realms of human endeavor, we're doing the opposite of what we should be doing. But I think that in order to confront the climate and other ecological challenges we face in the world, as well as the other risks we face in the world, nuclear risk and so much more, humanity has to start acting as one and seeing itself as one. There's rhetoric to this effect. We've heard it from Americans, we've heard it from Xi Jinping, we've heard it from others. Some people talk about it, but no one's doing anything about it in public life. However, as you know from reading the book, I stress that despite that, there are literally millions of people in the world who are working at the grassroots of the world, trying to achieve the different goals of sustainable development, healthcare, education, climate, water, so many other areas of human need and human endeavor. And these people are not only working out often and usually outside of governments and experiments in democratic participation, experiments in true self-rule, but they are beginning to link up and scale up globally. Mm-hmm. And they're working beyond the traditional borders, those invisible political lines that we've placed on the globe that in reality don't exist.
So just to pin the point on some specifics. So in the past, we have had visionaries, or at least self-proclaimed visionaries, who said, for example, with respect to UN reform, that we should create a different kind of UN General Assembly that more is parliamentary in fashion, represents people by population, for instance. And the problem then was, where are we going to find an arena big enough to represent people in any kind of corresponding fashion, even if you say it's 300,000 per individual. And what I think you're suggesting is technology today can come to help in that regard.
Indeed.
We don't need an arena, in other words.
No. In fact, as you know, I propose that these circles of participation be comprised of 151 people representing the whole world. in terms of scientific random sampling, we have a distinct advantage over the ancient Athenians. They had their own machine, I'll call it. It was a stone and wood machine called a Clarotarian. You can see it in the Agra Museum in Athens that provided them with random selection. But we have scientific random sampling. And what matters in random sampling is not the size of the population, is the size of the sample and the fact that the sample is random. And so believe it or not, counterintuitively, sort of like free trade, you can have a relatively small group of people who, if they are chosen randomly, can represent millions and reflect a mirror of that population. In terms of the United Nations, I certainly would not oppose the creation of a parliamentary assembly. And I've talked with the people who propose it, and I've added my name to theirs. But what I proposed is that there too we circumvent nation states.
Mhm.
The parliamentary assembly would have a delegation from Canada, a delegation from the United States, a delegation from China. And one wonders, when most of the countries in the world are not democratic, just how these delegations would be chosen and how democratic that result would be. There's already a democratic deficit of great proportions in a lot of these international institutions. Why add to it? I've said that we should have a citizens' assembly in the United Nations instead of a parliamentary assembly, and it should have to be equal in decision-making authority to the General Assembly we have now.
Now, despite the grave skepticism that I think many people would have with some of these proposals.
No, rightly so, because of course, nothing that's that looks politically impossible ever becomes possible until people believe that it will be.
But I will say there is a move, even within the state UN, to have representation through their NGOs, consultative status, and so forth, be represented in a way that sort of hints in your direction. And you even have a little passage that reflects it, which is to consider affected persons as the criteria. If you are affected by the law, you should have a role in making the law, in interpreting it, and in enforcing it.
Yes, and you're quite right. I did discuss that at length in the literature relating to it in the book. Well, let's look, for example, at two groups of people in the world: indigenous peoples. There are, I don't know, 500 million indigenous peoples, maybe more. They're scattered in 100 different countries. Sometimes there are several dozen groups in one country, such as in China or Brazil. And, are their interests really going to be represented at the global level by that particular country? Are they represented now? What about people with various physical challenges? There are more than 500 million of them. Are they going to be adequately represented? Are they now? I recall when we took up the Americans with Disability Act 35 years ago in the Congress. To his credit, first President Bush pushed that through against great opposition from the business community. A lot of people suddenly discovered that all these people lived in America. Millions and millions and millions of them. I think we need to go around the nation states. I think that the nearly 400 years in which we've lived under exclusively the Westphalian system is more than long enough. We had a constitutional moment in 1945 where we did a lot of good things. We stopped short of what we should have done at that time. I believe that some of what I'm proposing now and some of what other people are proposing as well, I'm not the only person in the world with ideas, it should have been done in 1945. But that's no excuse for not doing them now. And the fact that it seems so politically hard to do, well, I've heard that before.
Well, that actually brings up another historical take, because you have different components of the philosophy of the book, let's just say. And one is history, and one of it does take off from this notion: here are all the crisis moments that we wasted. And that here's another moment in time when, if we don't waste this crisis, we could do something to fix the institutions that need fixing, which is all of them at both the national and international level.
And my proposals, you know this, but we haven't talked about it. My proposals are to apply a sortition to create self-rule, not just at the international level, but at every level.
Right. And so I guess the question that looms large is, particularly, but not only, in countries, say China, where it is very difficult to find civil society that is not controlled by or dictated by the government, how would we begin the grassroots kind of movement that is difficult enough in a country like the United States, but becomes almost inconceivable, where, for example, the leading group for women's rights in China is state-controlled, and therefore some issues that the state doesn't want to approach are not raised by the women's movement.
Well, there's some practical aspects of this. One of them is just the very process of eliciting volunteers to put their names forward for random selection. Now, there are some precedents in the development of Sustainable Development Goals. The United Nations reached out ultimately to 5 or 6 million people who volunteered. And now we have registered with the UN, at last count, about 50,000 different international groups that are working toward achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The vast majority of them grassroots volunteer groups. And most estimates are that that's a small fraction of how many of these groups actually exist around the planet. Just to get population data to provide for random selection requires some level of cooperation from what might be recalcitrant nation states. China's not the only one. There are quite a few others that are authoritarian, and I can't see the Trump administration cooperating with this either. Can you?
No, I can't.
I'm not sure they'll want to take a census again. They're abolishing all kinds of other metrics.
Yeah, even the census would go too far.
But this is why I suggest you simply go around with the nation states to the extent that you can. There are other ways to get that data with the Citizens Assembly effort that began in Brazil, following on Glasgow. We've used NASA data that exists and is publicly available. And I've also proposed in the book that if a nation state refuses to cooperate, that it pay the penalty of forfeiting its rights under whatever particular institution is trying to engage in this sortition effort. If it is, for example, the World Trade Organization and the United States chose not to cooperate, then it should forfeit its rights under the WTO treaty. The obstacles are many,
right? Of
course, but as with anything that's worthwhile, one has to try, or it will never get done. The space station is circling overhead because we won the vote in the House 218 to 217.
Wow, one vote.
A year before that vote, we were 120 votes short.
Wow.
I announced I was not going to seek another term, and I voted all of my time in that last year to winning that vote. I wasn't alone. I'm not saying I did that alone by any means. There were many of us working on it, but that's how close a call it was. And we were told a year beforehand we would never get the votes.
So that raises another part of the book that is more sort of philosophical, some would call it almost quasi-religious. And that is that given the turn to authoritarianism in the world, it takes a great deal of gumption, courage, and a wild amount of optimism to write a book like this and to seriously propose it for adoption. And along the way, I think you address it by saying that we all have, both a collective and as individuals, a duty, what you call a duty of optimism. Can you say more about why we have that duty? Does it come itself from the Greeks? And I guess, what is the origin of it? How do you see it? Is it related to how Martin Luther King, now that we've just celebrated his holiday, saw the history and movement and progress? So say more about why we all, and I'm particularly sensitive to this since I'm surrounded by fatalistic international lawyers who see the world collapsing, and I sometimes join in that fatalism. Tell me why I should be hopeful, not just because it's a good thing, but because I have a duty to be hopeful.
You're certainly right, Jose, that I emphasize the duty of optimism. Let me first say that is not my phrase, as I acknowledge in the book. That is a phrase of Karl Popper, the great philosopher of the open society. I've been greatly influenced by him. I'm not a classicist, and I don't know that all classicists would describe the Athenians as optimists. Entire books have been written about when the idea of progress originated. Other books have been written saying progress doesn't exist. I'm discussing this in my next book, by the way. But Popper was inspired by the Athenians in part, and he basically explained that our mere existence itself is a reason for optimism. Look at the universe in which we live, its vastness, its inexplicability to our little minds. Yet here we are, and we know we're here. And is it possible that we're here without any purpose at all? Only as some Darwinian consequence of, if you will, of random selection. And I'm one of these people who choose to believe that there is a purpose in being here. There is a purpose in life. The purpose, I believe, is to serve life by defending life and helping create more life. And that means not only serving others like ourselves, other human beings, but also everything else on this planet, especially other species, animals, and more. So I look at that in a holistic sense, and my conclusion is that the purpose of life is to serve other people. Many people can reach that conclusion for different reasons, that same conclusion for different reasons. So there can be religious reasons, spiritual reasons unrelated to any organized religion, purely secular reasons.
Right. The book is definitely secular. I don't detect that this is a Judeo-Christian motivation or a Confucianism or anything else in the book.
Well, I believe that this is a conclusion that all humans should reach because they are humans. I also think that many religions at their best grapple toward the same conclusion.
Along the way, and I promise, so what we're doing now, just to inform those online, we mentioned this before we started to those here, is we're going to turn to both those here present in the room and those online. If those online could present their questions to the Q&A box, then we have someone here who will go through the questions and pose those. And of course, we will turn to you in the room for questions. But I guess my final question would be to present some of your views of what a good leader should be, because I think it targets some leaders that we might have in particular in mind, which is a tolerance, not making immigrants enemies, not making our fellow citizens enemies, respectful of facts, and so forth. Is sortism really going to solve the problem that in the United States you point to political parties as part of the problem, and to the absence of that type of leadership within the parties? Can you say more about how we get to a leader, and I totally agree with the qualities you outlined for a leader, how we get there, because we need leaders within this thing called nation states. How do we get that?
Recall for a moment the structure that I have in mind. I'm seeking the combination of the best of individual wisdom and the best of collective wisdom. The best of collective wisdom will come through sortition, through random selection. You're asking me now about how we get the best of individual wisdom through representation, how we get what I describe as right representation instead of the self-serving, self-defeating kind of representation we largely get now, not only in the United States, but in other democracies. And here I'm not pointing to any one party. I think this is true of all our parties and of many of our leaders, unfortunately. First of all, I think it is the role of a leader to bring people together and not pull them apart. This requires a true leader to try their best to find common ground, and where they cannot find it, to do what they can to try to help create it. In so doing, I think a genuine leader in engaging in the right kind of representation has an obligation to deal with facts. This often will require that leader to tell people what they don't want to hear. A finger in the wind through a political poll of a passing political view of a majority of the moment does not suffice. What a leader must do, if they're truly going to represent the people, is try to reflect not just their passing fancy of the moment, but their best interests. And in representative democracy, the remedy is at the ballot box. If I'm a leader and in trying to represent the best interests of people, they determine that I have failed, then they can throw the rascal out and I'll become a former leader. I think that fundamentally, therefore, it does matter what the character of a leader is. And here I'm not talking about sexual peccadillos. I'm talking about the ability to put foremost the desire to do what's right, what's truly needed, as opposed to simply getting reelected or climbing the political ladder.
Or winning certain prizes.
Or winning certain prizes. And I would say further that a true leader is one who reaches out to the people to try to find out what their needs truly are, who listens to them. Mm-hmm. What we have now is a pervasive lack of trust among people of all their leaders, not just political leaders, but institutions of all kinds. They don't trust experts, they don't trust educators, they don't trust CEOs, they don't trust bank presidents, they don't trust a lot of elites, and oftentimes with good reason. Experts have led them wrong. This doesn't mean that we necessarily need to avoid expert advice. No, what we need to do is weigh expert advice democratically through a reasoned process on the basis of facts, which is not what we're doing right now in this country and in many other countries in the world. We need leaders who will do that. And we need leaders who will not just stand up and proclaim to the people, but who will work alongside them, work together with them so that they can share in a sense of accomplishment.
Well, actually, you've provided a good sense of a mighty, powerful, and interesting book. So let's turn to folks in the room first. If you have the privilege of asking questions, please. And I'll repeat the question if they can't hear it on the mic.
May I say thank you all for being here. Very much appreciated.
Don't be shy.
One of the points I make in the book is that in addition to needing leaders who will actually lead. We need citizens who will actually follow leaders who have the courage to lead. And without them, true leaders are not going to survive because they won't win election or re-election. More important than having the best leaders is having the best citizens. And we're missing in that too for all kinds of reasons, ranging from our failure to engage in the right kinds of collective action to our failure as a country to provide the right kinds of education.
Do we have any questions online? Oh, there's one here. Yeah.
If you would tell me your name and where you're from, and if you would speak up, please, so I can hear you.
Kristen Kafasov, I'm a visiting scholar here.
Where are you from?
Eastern Europe.
Okay.
Originally. My question sort of was in the post-Cold War era, even now 35 years ago, some of what you were talking about of how like the post-state and the post-national boundaries was sort of the zeitgeist of the time period in the 90s and the 2000s, but it was more in like globalization in the name of what we now call neoliberalism. And how
Let me interject here. I think
how's that
neoliberalism is a misnomer.
Okay.
Because it's rarely defined. It's one of these catch-all phrases that ranges from everything to Milton Friedman, to Herbert Spencer from a century and a half ago. There are a lot of things that are imputed to neoliberals, of whom I'm supposed to be one in a lot of these tellings, that have never remotely been part of anything I believe. For example, laissez-faire. If you're talking about since the advent of Reagan and Thatcher, a retreat from the belief that there is a positive role for government to play in shaping an economic future democratically, then that's certainly happened. And the record will reflect that I've been on the other side. But I wouldn't describe that as neoliberalism, nor did Thatcher or Reagan describe it as that. And so there are a lot of generalities here that I think lead to a lack of this understanding. My proposals in my book, once you read it, you'll see, have nothing whatsoever to do with conventional thoughts of left and right, either in this country or on the continent. Indeed, if you read the book, if you're a MAGA person and read the book, you probably say, well, yeah, this is what we need to do in terms of democratic participation. Because what at bottom are the MAGA people upset about? They're upset because they don't think they have any say in the control of their own lives. And they go off in all kinds of mistaken directions because of this, such as xenophobia, for example. But that's their basic concern. They think they don't control their own lives. And post-war, we had a lot of countries where a lot of people thought, well, for the first time in generations, we're going to be able to control our own lives and have more of a sense of the future. And there were a lot of people I admire, such as, for example, Václav Havel, that were pointing, I think, in the right direction. But to talk about globalization and neoliberalism as if somehow there are some infectious diseases is not the direction, I think, of a positive solution.
No, I completely agree. These are
You didn't say that. You just provoked the thought.
The term is very broad. I guess what I was saying is that during that time period, a lot of the global economy was we are more interconnected than we've ever been, and globalization is much more real now. But the political trends in Western democracies or even are against it. Well, I guess what I was trying to say.
Let's hear the question.
How do you differentiate? Like you're totally different, but structurally, how would that be different? The vision of having, let's say, a city-state or people that these networks transcend sort of the geopolitical dynamics.
That's a very good question, and I answer it in the book.
Yeah.
I'm not among those people who propose the abolition of nation states. I oppose the abolition of nation states.
And you're not proposing a world government.
I am very much opposed to a world government. What if we got the wrong one? And also I like the fact that the world is a diverse place. You know, our division in my country right now is at bottom a debate between and among Americans over what kind of country we want to be. There's one group of people who think America should be basically one ethnic group and maybe one sex. And then there's another group of Americans in which I find myself who think it's a great thing that there are all these different cultures, ethnicities who come together and believe in this idea called America. We used to call it a melting pot, didn't we? No one ever uses that phrase anymore. This is one reason why I've opposed the extremes of identity politics, because they pull people apart. They don't bring them together. You know, and again, I look at the transcending unity we share as one species among so many species on one planet, among who knows how many planets in a universe of billions upon billions of stars and billions upon billions of galaxies. Here, my space program education helps me along in my thinking. In the 1990s, we were very hopeful, and we went astray. And I think one of the reasons we went astray was because there was too much of that thinking about the notion that we should just let the markets do whatever they would, let capitalists do whatever they would. I believe in capitalism. I'm certainly a supporter of the free market, but I've never supported unrestricted markets or unrestricted capitalism. I believe we need to contain those things and make certain that they do work toward human well-being on a thriving planet. And there's studies that show that of all the GDP we've created over the past century through the employment of commercial forces, both in capitalist and non-capitalist states, we've actually destroyed more of the world's the value of more of the world's ecology to a much greater extent. So what have we gained? We haven't gained anything. We've lost. So I believe we need to change that. And that, sir, is the topic of the book I'm writing now.
But I guess one of the questions, maybe that I misunderstood the question, but if governments continue to exist, if nation states continue to exist, what is the role of, say, the institutions that we have, whether it's the WTO, the UN? There is this collective wisdom aspect, but what is the role of governments in those institutions? How do you see them working side by side?
Well, in terms of international institutions, they are not democratic now. I mean, how can we have democratic international institutions if they're based on nation states and the vast majority of the nation states are not democratic? We can't. So there is obviously a democratic deficit. The addition of democratically chosen, randomly selected circles of participation as decision-making bodies in all of these international institutions would make them more democratic, but would not change the other element, nor would it affect the execution, the executive branch.
So just say the Security Council would conceivably retain 15, 20 members.
Well, in the book, I propose expanding the Security Council and eliminating the veto.
But you still have nation states in that, but you would have a component.
Oh, I'm not proposing replacing the United Nations with a sortition assembly.
Okay.
I'm proposing a variation of what those who have sought a parliamentary assembly as an addition to the United States have proposed, the United Nations have proposed. I'm proposing that instead of adding a parliamentary assembly that's based on elections from nation states, we skip the nation states altogether and add a citizens assembly in which citizens of the world are elected as representatives, are chosen randomly as representatives of humanity to serve in
With some impact on what the Security Council is.
With some impact, because it would be a decision-making body. I'm not suggesting it being an advisory body. And as you know from reading the book, I also suggest that there would be two kinds of advisory bodies added to all these international organizations. Circles for the Future, comprised of people randomly selected from among volunteers throughout the world from the ages of 12 to 21. And Circles of Nature, to stand up for nature. Because guess what? The economy is within nature. Human beings are one part of nature. We're not separate and apart from the ecology of this world. We're merely a part of it within it. So I would propose that. And once again, I propose doing this at every level of governance everywhere in the world. Will this happen tomorrow? Of course not. Will it happen during my lifetime? I don't think so. Should it happen nonetheless, I've concluded it's the only way to achieve both democracy and sustainable development. And here, let me talk about sustainable development before we run out of time. This book is, I'm told, the first book that talks about the relationship between democracy and sustainable development. To me, the two are interrelated. We cannot have one without the other. We need governments that will promote both of them. Once we have true self-rule through the right kind of democratic governance, then the goal must be to have sustainable development. What is sustainable development? It's achieving the human goals of well-being that are contained, I think, as a good expression in the social, economic, and environmental goals of the United Nations. It is the human development that results from achieving the social, economic, and environmental goals of sustainable development that gives us as humans the capacity to engage in true, successful self-rule. And it is the exercise of true self-rule through the process of democracy that I think alone can provide us with the will and the way to move forward in achieving the social, economic, and environmental goals of sustainable development. So they are one and the same, interlinked, inextricable. And I don't think we can pursue one without pursuing the other. And in the absence of one, we won't achieve the other.
Do you have any quick questions that from
Yes.
the
So
Q&A?
a student, someone who identifies themselves as a law student from Wuhan, now at the University of Washington, says, oh, no, sorry, Washington University says, what practical advice do you offer Chinese scholars?
I congratulate the young scholar from Wuhan and making their way to Washington University. I would want them to know I've spent a great deal of time in China, dating back a number of decades, back to when I was first working while I was at USTR in the Carter administration on implementing the first bilateral trade agreement between China and the United States. And I've been back to China many times since. I don't think that the desires of the Chinese people for human well-being in a thriving world naturally and ecologically differ at all from those of people in the West. And in many ways, I think philosophically, culturally, and historically, the Chinese and other Asians are much farther along than we are in the West in trying to incorporate those goals in how they look at life. The impediment the Chinese people face is that they do not have the freedom to express themselves. And the freedom to engage in not only freedom of expression, free speech, but also free thought. The freedom of thought, the first freedom, is embattled everywhere in the world. Certainly it's embattled in China, but it's also embattled here in New York City in the United States of America. And people everywhere must, wherever they stand, find a way to stand up and fight. That's what it comes down to. For Americans, it may be simply voting. Other people elsewhere in the world are going to have to fight for their freedom. And I hope that we Americans will help them when they do.
Yeah. So
1 minute left.
yeah, somewhere earlier you said something made me think that there's already there are organizations or groups who are promoting this kind of agenda?
Yes.
If not, you're precisely, can you
Yeah.
tell us just briefly who
Yeah.
is doing what?
Yes, back at the, we're talking here about the climate negotiations, the climate conference of parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I was in Rio in 1992 when we approved that convention. I was one of the legal advisors to the United Nations along with others when we concluded the Paris Agreement in 2015. I think Professor Alvarez was involved in that as well. And I've been much involved in the climate effort for many years. In Glasgow, at a previous COP, for the first time, there was a citizens' assembly based on random selection. It falls short of the kind of perfect random selection that I propose in the book, which I think is necessary ultimately in order to provide for the consent that's necessary in governance. There's an important central question of consent to be governed. If you vote, then you've consented, but if there's some type of random selection, where's the consent? Well, I think if it's universal and everyone has an opportunity to participate, and it truly is random, then you can say there's consent. Anything less than that, not so much. But they're doing their best. And in November in Brazil, in Benin, there was another citizens' assembly based on a much improved version of random selection, again, a global selection of people, and of all kinds from all over the world, all volunteers. And at that time, not only did they hold that citizens' assembly at the COP, but they succeeded in, to their credit, the support of the government of Brazil and some others in having a citizen assembly made an institutional part going forward of every climate conference. Now there is a follow-up meeting in London next month. I will be there. I will be speaking to talk about where we go next, not only in the climate COP, but in trying to have similar citizen assemblies created alongside and ultimately inside all other international institutions. This is a reform that would revolutionize global governance. And I'm devoting my life now to working toward that end.
Well, we have to end on that optimistic note, which is characteristic of the book. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, and thank you all.